My name's David Lindenmayer from the Australian National University, and in this talk I wanted to touch on some key issues to do with the concept of adaptive monitoring. In particular, in this talk I wanted to talk about the importance of long-term monitoring, and then within that this notion of adaptive monitoring, and then finally touch on some ways to strengthen what's involved with monitoring through linking them to environmental and ecosystem accounting. So the notion of ecological monitoring is largely around repeated long-term measurements, typically over a period of more than 10 years, where the data are collected continuously or frequently and then analysed repeatedly. And this is a fairly loose definition that's come from a book with my esteemed colleague Jean Likens and published in 2018. So if we think about some of the key values of monitoring, the first ones are to quantify the responses to environmental change, to think about how to better understand some of the complex phenomena that characterise all ecosystems globally, and then provide the kinds of evidence that we need to make evidence-based policy and support evidence-based management. So I wanted to give a good example here of long-term data collection. So this is the measures of atmospheric carbon dioxide in Hawaii, and I've put in a red arrow to show when I was a plant physiology student in early 1980s, and we can see the massive changes in CO2 gathered over time. The importance of this is that the long-term time series really tell us about what's going on and how the atmosphere is changing. So there are people that love to look at these kinds of data sets and think about their view of global warming and changes in CO2 and temperatures, and then how the scientists amongst us look at the same data set and look at what's happening over time. So the key issue here is that monitoring really provides us with the empirical data that are really the only tests of theory. They provide the data on which we can do additional monitoring, and it creates a platform for all kinds of co-located collaborative research. And the best way to think about some of these potential values of monitoring is with an example. And a really good one in an Australian context is this notion of alpine burning. So throughout large parts of Australia, there are many people that want to see more grazing of domestic livestock in our alpine areas. And they have bumper stickers on their cars that say, "Alpine grazing reduces blazing." What do the data really show? Well, when we look at what's happening from long-term ecological sites, stretching back over 70 years in Australia's alpine environments, we discover that the vegetation in these areas has reasonable resilience to climate change. It has pretty good resilience to infrequent fire, but one of the things that the vegetation is very susceptible to is additional grazing by domestic livestock. And one of the reasons for that is that Australia has no animals with hooves as native herbivores. And what actually happens is that grazing changes the ecosystem and makes it more flammable. So despite what the bumper stickers are saying, long-term data shows that grazing may increase blazing. And we can see these kinds of changes in this slide here. Extensive grazing by domestic livestock essentially meant we lost low flammable alpine grasses and replaced them with more flammable alpine shrublands. We can only see these kinds of insights from long-term monitoring data. And we summarised a whole range of these kinds of perspectives on the importance of long-term studies in a paper published in 2012. And we summarised many of the key ideas about long-term monitoring and its value in a series of books that Jean Likens and I put together a few years ago. So we know what makes successful monitoring, and that's posing good questions at the outset of a monitoring program, thinking about a good conceptual model to help pose those questions, a good experimental design to help frame those questions and the kinds of work that you're going to do in the field, frequent use of the data that you gather so that you can see if there's some problems very early in the monitoring program, not right at the end. Making sure that the work that you do has a high level of management relevance. Scientists are really good at answering questions, but sometimes those questions are not particularly relevant to managers. So that's really important to think carefully about what you're doing relative to what managers need to know. Clearly, there's also issues around good data management, making sure that the data can be reused, but also being productive in a scientific capacity so that people can see value for money and return on investment for the monitoring work. And we know that there are some really severe barriers to effective monitoring. Limited dollars is clearly a major problem, but often some of the problems with monitoring are that the spatial coverage of how big the monitoring program is limited, and the frequency of survey effort means that we can't gather the kinds of data that are really needed to help solve particular problems. And sometimes there's just a limited understanding of what management effectiveness is all about and the kinds of questions that need to be answered to help managers manage the natural resources or reserves or other kinds of areas. And surprisingly, one of the things that we often see as a problem with monitoring data is that it actually doesn't get analysed. And so we can't really tell if, for example, a management intervention, for example, to control populations of animals has been effective or not. Now, the other thing that's really important in this context is that things change. And often monitoring programs don't have the flexibility to be able to respond to those changes. For example, a population may begin to decline very quickly, and there might need to be a comprehensive rethink of how a monitoring program is working. We might need to answer new questions that develop, and that may demand a new approach. And one of the key things is that if it's possible to build on the data sets that have been gathered in the past, then this may help ensure that we don't breach the integrity of the time series data set. And when you do that, it's very important to make sure that you calibrate the methods from the previous monitoring program to the one that's changed in the new monitoring program. So Gene Likens and I talked about this extensively and came up with this idea of adaptive monitoring. So it's a paradigm for thinking deeply about long-term research and monitoring and how you reshape questions to continue the monitoring program and continue to add value to what's already been gathered. And so this notion of an adaptive monitoring program, you set the questions, you design the monitoring approach, you collect the data, you analyze the data, it gives you better understanding, and then you have new questions that evolve, or there might be new technology, the use of drones or eDNA, and that means you need to go back to think about the questions again, and essentially you keep evolving the process to ensure that the monitoring is relevant and is connected to what you really need to understand. Again, the best way to illustrate this is with an example. So we have a long-term monitoring program at Buderi National Park. It's south of Sydney in New South Wales. And it's really quite an extraordinary place. And over the last 2 decades, there's been some really major challenges in this area that have really stimulated us to have to rethink how we do the monitoring program in that iconic reserve. So here is Buderi National Park, or Jervis Bay, south of Sydney, and the key aims in this park were to develop a very strong partnership between scientists and managers to help manage the biodiversity in this park, and particularly to help inform the process of what happens when we do feral animal control with foxes, when we control invasive plants, particularly bitter bush, and the interactions of fire with both feral animal control and weed control. So that work started in 2002 and it continues to this day. And it's a really iconic park for many reasons, partly because of its extraordinary biodiversity. And this species, the eastern bristlebird, has a stronghold within Buderi National Park, so much so that it's been the basis for a whole series of quite successful reintroductions of the species elsewhere in New South Wales. So this is Buderi National Park. It's about 6,500 hectares. There's 134 long-term sites across the park, Each site is indicated by a red dot on this map. And it's a highly fire-prone system. This system burns about every 5 to 10 years, and that's about normal for these kinds of coastal heathland environments, which are very species rich, both in terms of the plants, but also many of the animal species. And so we have extensive fire through this system, and we also have major problems with feral animals. This is a red fox, and there are poison bait stations right throughout the park. And what typically happens is that these bait stations are recharged with baits every 2 weeks, and the number of animal tracks from foxes and cats, as well as the numbers of baits that are taken, are recorded each time that there's a rebaiting at the stations. And we can see a significant decline in fox detections and the numbers of baits that are taken. One of the consequences of this highly successful intensive bait program is that we have a big increase in the number of native herbivores. So this is a swamp wallaby, and it and the eastern grey kangaroo have undergone substantial and quite systematic increases in population over time. And one of the things that we understand from this park is that when we have burn events, the vegetation changes in ways that makes it more palatable for animals such as the swamp wallaby, and that is changing the vegetation in quite dramatic ways. So we have increases in macropods, we have recurrent wildfire, and we have an increase in browsing pressure across the park. So we wanted to look at the impacts of this, and we put up a whole series of artificial fences, exclosure zones, and as part of the work there, we were also using drift fences with plastic drift material to exclude animals and to capture things on the ground, particularly small mammals and reptiles. And what we discovered after a few years was that we were having enormous attrition of the plastic drift fences and the other fencing material. The wallabies were actually eating the plastic. And this made it impossible to continue to monitor our 134 sites on a regular basis in the way that we had been doing that previously. This was totally unexpected. There's nowhere in any of the mammal guidebooks that tells you that wallabies will eat massive amounts of plastic in their diet. And it was impossibly expensive to keep replacing all of that plastic drift fences. So we had to change the way that we were doing our sampling dramatically across the park to maintain the integrity of the time series data that were being gathered. So the way that we did that was to have a crossover time where we had both protocols running and calibrate the sampling against the different methods that we were using. And this was critical so that we could maintain the integrity of the time series as populations of animals were changing and we were having different grazing pressure in the system. So we had to move to artificial substrates and use timber and tiles instead of pitfall traps as one of the ways that we were sampling for animals. And that has big implications for the kinds of species you capture and the abundances of different animals. And the key issue here is that we didn't want to confound sampling methodology and time with changes in populations. So adaptive monitoring is really critical here. We had a number of changes in the questions that managers wanted to answer. We had new demands from the reserve managers about understanding what was happening in the system with recurrent fire. And we had new insights that were telling us that we needed to maintain the integrity of the data sets, but we had to change the protocols that we were using to collect those data sets. Now, in the last part of this talk, I wanted to touch on this issue of ways to keep monitoring happening. We know from across the world that typically budgets for monitoring are very small, and that monitoring is the last thing funded and the first thing cut. And we had begun to work with environmental accountants and economists through some of our long-term studies, and recognised that there was a key link to what's called economic and environmental accounting. And that therein started to support this notion that there were very valuable ways to be able to maintain monitoring by making it even more relevant, not only to land managers, but also policymakers. So the best way, again, to illustrate this is through an example. We're going to shift to another area where we have the wet forests of Victoria, where we have used environmental and economic accounting. So this area is down in the Central Highlands of Victoria, the wet forests, and these are truly spectacular forests. There's a photograph of me in the forest in a red jumper, a red sweatshirt, and this is a stand of trees about 90 to 100 metres tall. Absolutely beautiful forests. They're very rich in biodiversity. This is the arboreal marsupial assemblage, so there's about 8 species in this group, and we're dealing with about 100 species of birds, which is relatively species rich for this part of the world. Almost all of the water for the city of Melbourne, about 5 million people, depend on the water supply from the forests in this area. And we also see that the main forms of natural disturbance in these systems are again fire, and the main form of human disturbance is clear cutting to produce mostly pulpwood to make paper with a limited amount of timber. So what we wanted to do was to look at the economic value of the natural assets in these ecosystems. There's a very substantial amount of conflict between people concerned about conservation values, timber values, water values, and tourism values in this system. So we used the system of environmental and economic accounting that was developed by the United Nations, the SEA framework it's called, and this has been in place since 2012, and we wanted to engage with this to look at the relative values of the different natural assets and their contributions to regional GDP. So we used our long-term data sets gathered since 1983 to populate the accounts. So we had data on the water values, the carbon values, timber, tourism, agriculture and biodiversity from this Central Highlands region where these forests occur. And we published this work in 2017. It was led by Heather Keith, who's a carbon specialist, and Michael Varden, who used to be with the Australian Bureau of Statistics, both of whom have expertise in environmental accounting. And really, the results were quite stark. What we see here is that the value of agriculture is by far and away the most important natural asset in this area, but it's not through grazing, it's actually through horticulture and providing food for Melbourne about an hour and a half from this region. The water values are enormous. We can see again $310 million as opposed to 312. The tourism industry is very lucrative. Carbon values are reasonably high. And here was the most important part of the conflict between these different industries. The native forest timber industry in this area is worth about 25.5 times less than the value of the water industry and about 20 times less than the tourism industry. And so this is quite important in terms of thinking about the different trade-offs. So what we've also done is what happens if you were to move from native forest harvesting to plantation-only harvesting in this system and leave the native forest to produce water and to support a tourism industry. And what we see is actually the carbon industry, the plantation industry, the tourism industry and the water supply industry all increase quite markedly if you were to remove native forest harvesting from this area. So this has been really quite important for several reasons. The first one is it's really alerted the state government of Victoria to rethink the different values of these native forest assets, but it's also reinforced the importance of monitoring. So monitoring the water supply in terms of water yields from forests of different ages, monitoring the carbon stocks and flows through repeated vegetation measurements, and monitoring the extent of tourism visits and their contributions to regional GDP. So the accounts underscore the economic value of conservation in this particular area, particularly through tourism, but also through water, because the water catchments need to be supporting forests that are as old as possible and as undisturbed as possible to produce the most water. And the monitoring data are critical to support the notion of accounts. Now, there are other really good examples of this. Michael Varden has worked extensively in Botswana and looked at the trade-off between the value of elephants as part of the tourism industry and how much water is consumed by those wild animals, as opposed to the value of water for the agriculture industry and domestic livestock. And in the case of Botswana, the value of the water for tourism greatly exceeds the value of the water for agriculture. So in summary, we all know that monitoring is critical. We also know that long-term monitoring is particularly important, but sometimes that long-term monitoring needs to change. There are new questions, there are new issues to deal with, there's a change in technology, and adaptive monitoring to change the frame for how you do long-term monitoring can be crucial to make sure that you maintain the integrity of the data sets and to ensure that the time series data that are being gathered continue to be important for management. And there are ways to secure both conventional monitoring and adaptive monitoring, and environmental and economic accounting can be a really important way to support that.